"If you make me walk, I'll give you my fortune," shouted the bitter wheelchair-bound CEO, Ricardo, humiliating the new cleaner's son in front of the entire company. Cynical after the doctors gave up, he saw the challenge as a joke. But the boy, fearless, knelt down and rubbed a strong-smelling ointment on his lifeless legs. Ricardo mocked him, but to prove the farce, tried to move his muscles, and what his eyes saw next made him scream, leaving the whole room in shock. Richard's skepticism was his armor, a fortress of steel and glass built around a heart he believed had stopped beating 5 years ago. At the same instant, his car twisted into a heap of useless metal. That day, he lost the two things that defined his existence: his beloved wife, Helena, and the use of his legs. Now, the man who built Titan Mining from the ground up, an industry giant that had earned him an incalculable fortune, was a king on a throne of wheels, ruling an empire of numbers and charts that no longer brought him any satisfaction. The vastness of his net worth, with investments in the stock market and even volatile cryptocurrencies, felt like a sick joke. What good was having the world at his feet if he couldn't take a single step upon it? The board meeting dragged on in the panoramic conference room of his Manhattan penthouse, an environment as cold and impersonal as the figures projected on the wall. The afternoon sun bathed the sprawling city below, but inside that room, the only light was the frigid glint of ambition in the director's eyes. Richard felt frustration bubbling in his chest, a bitter bile rising in his throat. Every forced smile, every handshake he couldn't return while standing, was a fresh stab to his wounded pride. He had been instructed to be cordial, to ensure the profits would continue to flow, but patience was a resource his capital could no longer buy. In a discreet corner of the room, almost blending into the minimalist decor, was Clara, the new cleaning lady, a woman with a weary face but a quiet dignity that made her stand out. Beside her, sitting on a small stool, was David, her son. Richard had been explicit, no children in the office. But a last-minute problem at the daycare had forced her to disobey, and the look of panic in her eyes when Richard had glared at her earlier was almost satisfying to his sour mood. The boy, however, was the embodiment of stillness. At 10 years old, with a gaze that seemed to hold the serenity of a monk, he just watched, not making a sound. During a coffee break, as the men in suits clustered together to whisper about business and dividends, the unthinkable happened. The silence was broken by a curious, childish voice. David had timidly approached Richard's wheelchair, his large brown eyes fixed, not with pity, but with a genuine question. "Sir, why don't you walk?" The question fell like a stone into the polished silence of the room. All eyes turned to them. Richard felt the blood rush to his face, the audacity of the child, the exposure of his greatest weakness in front of his audience of sharks. A cruelty he hadn't felt in a long time took hold of him. He looked at the directors, a sarcastic smile forming on his lips. "Because I don't want to," he sneered, and the servile, awkward laughter of the men echoed through the space. He turned to the boy, his eyes glinting. "But you know what? If you can make me walk, I'll give you my fortune. I dare you, kid." The humiliation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara, pale as wax, rushed to pull her son from the situation, whispering desperate apologies. "No!" Richard's voice cut the air like a whip, and he raised a hand to stop her. He accepted the challenge. "Go on, cure me." To Clara's absolute terror and the astonishment of everyone else, David didn't back down. He looked into the millionaire's eyes, a seriousness unusual for his age, and said with disarming simplicity, "My grandma back in the Appalachian Mountains gave me a remedy that warms the bones." The boy took a small, old, and dented tin from his backpack and opened it, revealing a dark green paste with a strong, earthy smell like pine needles and damp soil. Ignoring the snickers and disdainful looks, he knelt before the most powerful man in the room and, with surprising gentleness, began to rub the strange substance onto Richard's pale, lifeless legs. The touch of the small hands was warm, a stark contrast to the chronic coldness of his skin. After a few moments, David stood up and looked at Richard, his face a mask of confidence. "There, now try." "Pathetic," Richard spat. The word echoed in the silent room. He looked at each of the smug faces around him. He would prove the farce, crush the ridiculous hope in the eyes of that boy and his mother. To seal the humiliation, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and with all the force of his will, focused on moving a muscle that hadn't responded in 5 long years. The silence in the room was so absolute that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. For a moment, nothing happened. Richard kept his eyes closed, his jaw locked, waiting for the confirmation of his own bitterness, the sweet taste of being right once more. But then a strange, long-forgotten sensation began to tingle at the base of his spine. It was like the stirring of a dormant animal, a mild warmth that spread slowly, down through his hips and thighs. He frowned, still with his eyes closed. It was just his mind, playing tricks on him. A phantom hope. He focused harder, not to move, but to feel. The warmth intensified, turning into a sharp, almost painful prickling, like thousands of fine needles piercing his skin. A gasp escaped his lips. He opened his eyes, sweat beading on his forehead. His gaze dropped, disbelieving, to his feet. And then it happened. The little toe on his right foot, a part of his body that had been as inert as a stone for 5 years, twitched. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it was undeniable. A collective, muffled cry echoed through the boardroom. The shareholders, men who dealt in the coldness of numbers and the volatility of the stock market, took a step back as if they had seen a ghost. Their faces, once mocking, were now pale, stamped with a mixture of shock and dread. Richard felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Trembling, his breath held. He tried again. He channeled every ounce of his will, every drop of his fury and despair into that leg. This time, the response was violent. His entire right leg spasmed, lifting a few inches off the wheelchair's footrest before falling back, heavy and inert. It was enough. The dam he had built around his heart for half a decade broke. Hot, salty tears streamed down his face. The first tears since the day he lost Helena. They weren't of sorrow, but of a shock so profound it transcended joy or pain. It was the sound of an entire world shattering. "Out," he managed to say, his voice hoarse and choked. "All of you, out! The meeting is over." No one argued. The men, whose decisions could alter the flow of millions of dollars, gathered their briefcases in a stunned silence and filed out of the room like scolded schoolboys, casting frightened glances at Richard, at the boy, and at the small tin can. In minutes, the room was empty, except for the 3 of them. Clara was huddled near the door, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with fear and amazement. David, on the other hand, remained calm, watching Richard with the same serenity as before, as if a miracle were the most natural thing in the world. Richard wiped his face on the back of his hand, his whole body trembling with adrenaline and shock. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he saw her not as an insignificant employee, but as the bearer of an impossible key. His vast wealth, his immense net worth, all of it seemed irrelevant now. "You," he said, his voice still shaky but laden with an unshakable authority. "You and the boy, you're not going anywhere." Clara took a frightened step back. "Mr. Richard, we have to go. I swear I don't know what happened. It's just an old recipe of my grandmother's." "I don't care what it is," he cut her off, maneuvering the wheelchair to block the exit. His eyes, once cold and dead, now burned with a desperate intensity. That was more than all my doctors, all my money, managed in 5 years. I don't know what's in that tin, but I am not letting it out of this house." He looked from the mother to the son, the mind of a ruthless negotiator taking over from the emotional shock. He knew he couldn't force them. He had to make an offer, an investment that would secure their stay. He needed them more than he needed his next billion. "Starting today," he declared, the decision solidifying in his voice, "you two are moving in here." Richard's declaration hung in the air, as heavy and imposing as the skyscrapers that framed the view from his penthouse. Clara stared at him, then at the door, then at David, who remained surprisingly calm at her side. Live here in this gilded cage of glass and steel, with a man whose bitterness was so palpable you could almost touch it. The idea was absurd, terrifying. She was a simple woman, accustomed to a life of hard work and small joys. Richard's universe, a world of multi-million-dollar deals, of figures with so many zeros her mind could barely process them, was completely alien and intimidating. Sir, we can't," she stammered, clutching David's hand tightly. "We have our home, our life." "I'll buy your home," he interrupted, the impatience of a man used to having the world at his feet leaking into his tone. "I'll pay double, triple its value. Money is not the issue. Don't you understand what happened here?" He gestured toward his legs with a sharp movement of his head. This is more valuable than my entire net worth. I need you. I need that ointment." His eyes fixed on the small tin that David still held. Clara felt a chill. The ointment was an heirloom from her grandmother, a folk healer from the Appalachian Mountains, whose knowledge of the region's herbs was passed down through generations. It was a family recipe, a closely guarded secret. To them, it was a home remedy for aches and pains, something as common and familiar as chamomile tea. But in that man's eyes, she saw something dangerous. Obsession. She saw the same relentless determination that had undoubtedly helped him build his vast fortune. "It's not that simple," she tried to argue, her voice a little steadier. "The recipe belongs to my grandmother. Then bring your grandmother here too," Richard retorted without hesitation. "I'll pay whatever it takes. Give her the best suite, the best doctors, anything she wants. Set up a trust for her, an investment that will make her rich." The ease with which he spoke of moving people, of buying lives, shocked Clara to her core. To him, everything was a transaction, a calculation of assets and liabilities. She glanced at David, looking for any sign of fear or discomfort, but the boy just watched the exchange with his serene eyes. It was he who spoke, his voice small but clear, cutting through the tension. "My grandma doesn't like the big city," he said. She says the air is sad." Richard stared at him, for a moment speechless. He was used to dealing with aggressive executives and shrewd lawyers, not the disarming logic of a child. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to change tactics. Aggression wouldn't work here. He needed to appeal to something else, something he barely remembered how to use. Vulnerability. "Please," he said, and the word felt foreign on his own tongue. I lost everything 5 years ago. I lost my wife. I lost the ability to walk. I've built an empire, but I live in a prison. Today, for the first time, I felt hope, a spark. Don't take that away from me." The mask of cruelty fell away, revealing the broken man underneath. The tears had dried, but the pain in his eyes was raw and undeniable. Clara felt her heart clench. She knew the pain of loss, the daily struggle to keep going. Her own life wasn't easy. Raising a son alone, working 2 jobs to pay the bills, was a constant battle. She saw in the wealthy man's face a reflection of her own weariness, a loneliness that transcended any bank account. Before she could answer, the conference room door opened and a tall, elegant woman in an impeccable power suit entered. It was Beatrice, Richard's younger sister and vice president of Titan Mining. Her blue eyes, cold as ice, surveyed the scene. Her brother with his tear-streaked face. The cleaning lady and her son huddled near the door. "Richard, what is going on in here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "The board members are panicking in the hallway. They're talking about spasms and miracle cures." What did you do? Richard ignored her, his eyes still fixed on Clara. I will give you anything you want, he said to her, his voice low and intense. A home, security for your son, a life without financial worries. Your cash flow will be constant. In return, you just have to stay. Help me. Beatrice stepped forward, contempt plain on her face as she looked at Clara and David. Richard, that's enough of this madness. Send these people away. You're embarrassing yourself. But Richard wasn't listening. He saw only the woman and the boy who held the key to his freedom. Clara looked at her son, who gave her a small nod, a gesture of trust that gave her the strength she needed. She took a deep breath. We'll stay, she said, her voice louder than she expected. But not for your money. We'll stay on one condition. Beatrice snorted in disbelief. Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What condition? Clara looked him straight in the eye, her dignity returning like a wave. You will treat us with respect. We are not your employees. We are your partners on this journey. And you will learn to say please and thank you. The room plunged into a shocked silence. Beatrice stared at her as if she had just committed blasphemy. Richard, however, after a long moment of surprise, tilted his head, and then, for the first time in a very long time, a genuine, unexpected sound escaped his lips, a short, dry laugh. Richard's laugh, short and rusty from disuse, echoed in the silent room, surprising everyone, including himself. It was the sound of a crack opening in the icy facade he presented to the world. Beatrice stared at him, her thin lips pressed into a line of pure disapproval. To her, this wasn't just an eccentricity, it was a sign of weakness, a dangerous vulnerability that could compromise everything they had built. The Titan mining empire hadn't been built on feelings, but on cold logic, on market analysis and profit maximization. Emotions were liabilities, and her brother was about to make a disastrous investment. Have you completely lost your mind, Richard? She hissed, stepping forward, deliberately placing herself between him and Clara like a lioness protecting her territory. Are you actually going to listen to these people? Look at them. It's a grift, obviously. They're after your fortune. She gestured dismissively toward Clara and David, who instinctively flinched under her cold gaze. Richard held up a hand, silencing her. Beatrice, for the first time in 5 years, I felt something in my legs, something the best specialists in the world, with all my money, said was impossible. Do you think I'm going to let that slip away because of your prejudice? This isn't prejudice, it's common sense, she retorted, her voice rising an octave. It's about protecting our assets, our bottom line. Think of the shareholders, the company's reputation. What am I supposed to tell them? That the billionaire CEO of Titan is putting his future, and consequently all of our investments, in the hands of a cleaning lady and her snake oil? Clara felt her face burn with humiliation. Every word from Beatrice was a slap. She wanted to take David by the hand and run out of that penthouse, away from this world where people were valued by their bank balance. But then she felt her son's small hand squeeze hers firmly, and his serene gaze met hers, transmitting a silent strength. She remembered her condition. She was not a beggar. She was a partner. Straightening her shoulders, she met Beatrice's furious gaze. With all due respect, ma'am, Clara said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. We didn't ask for anything. Your brother made us a dare, and then a proposal, and we are not interested in his money. Beatrice let out a disbelieving laugh. Oh, aren't you? Of course not. I suppose you live on sunshine and fresh air. Richard intervened, his voice sharp as steel. That's enough, Beatrice. The decision is mine. They stay, and they stay as my guests. If you can't accept that, the door is right there. The ultimatum hung between the two siblings. Beatrice's eyes flashed. She knew that tone. It was the Richard who closed impossible deals, who didn't take no for an answer. She had lost, for now. With a stiff movement, she turned. Do whatever you want, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "But when this farce falls apart and drags our family name and the value of our stock through the mud, don't say I didn't warn you." She walked past Clara without a glance, but Clara felt the wave of hostility emanating from her, a silent promise that the war had only just begun. As soon as Beatrice left, slamming the door behind her, a tense silence settled. Richard seemed exhausted by the confrontation. He turned to Clara, his expression softening fractionally. I apologize for my sister. She's protective of the family business." He pressed a button on his wheelchair, activating an intercom. "Melissa, please come to the conference room and prepare the second-floor guest suite for Miss Clara and her son. They will be staying with us indefinitely." The assistant's voice on the other end hesitated for a second, filled with surprise before replying with a professional, "Yes, sir." Clara watched it all as if in a dream. A guest suite. Indefinitely. An hour ago, she was worried about getting fired. Now, she was being moved into the home of one of the richest men in America. As an efficient-looking woman led them out of the room, Clara glanced back one last time. Richard wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on his own legs, a look of terrified hope on his face. Far away, in her own office overlooking the city, Beatrice picked up her phone. Her expression was cold and calculating. "Harris," she said to her head of security, "I need a full background check, a new cleaning employee. Her name is Clara. Find everything on her, where she came from, who she is, and what her angle is." The transition from Clara's simple, predictable life to the opulent luxury of Richard's penthouse was abrupt and disorienting. The guest suite was larger than her entire apartment in the Bronx. The walls were adorned with art that she guessed cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. From the window, the view of the Central Park skyline stretched out like a postcard, a scene she had only ever seen on television. David, unlike her, explored the new environment with a fearless curiosity. He skated across the polished marble floors, tested the softness of the king-sized bed, and was fascinated by the television that rose out of a cabinet at the foot of the bed with the touch of a button. For him, it was a grand adventure. For Clara, it felt like a gilded prison. In the days that followed, a strange routine began to take hold. Twice a day, morning and evening, she and David would meet with Richard. The ritual was always the same. In an almost ceremonial silence, David would kneel and, with unwavering concentration, apply the green ointment to Richard's legs. Clara watched, her heart tight, feeling like an accomplice in a play whose script she didn't know. Richard was a difficult patient. His impatience was a force of nature. With every application, he expected an instant miracle, a repeat of the shocking event in the boardroom. But recovery wasn't a lightning strike. It was a slow, almost imperceptible process. The warmth and tingling would return, sometimes more intensely, sometimes weaker. There were days when he could twitch his calf muscles, and others when his legs remained stubbornly inert. Every small step forward was followed by a wave of euphoric hope. Every period of stagnation plunged him into a dark, irritable despair. "This isn't working," he'd snarl, slamming his fist on the arm of his wheelchair. "It's weaker than the first time. What's wrong with your potion?" Clara, who had spent her life learning that patience was the only tool of the poor, tried to soothe him. "Richard, please," she'd say, using his first name as he had insisted, though the word still felt strange on her lips. "My grandmother always says the earth's healing is in no hurry. It respects the body's time." "Time!" he'd scoff. "I don't have time. I've lost 5 years of my life. I want to walk now." His frustration poisoned the air of the penthouse. He took it out on the staff, was curt on the phone with his executives, and barely spoke to his sister, Beatrice, who hovered in the background like an ominous shadow. Her presence was a constant pressure on Clara. Though they exchanged nothing more than formal greetings, Clara felt the weight of Beatrice's gaze on her, a cold, analytical stare that stripped her bare, searching for flaws, for secrets. One afternoon, as Clara organized her few clothes in the suite's immense walk-in closet, she found Beatrice standing in her doorway. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" Clara asked cautiously. Beatrice swept into the room, her stilettos clicking authoritatively on the marble. She didn't look at Clara, but at the simple clothes hanging beside the silk robes provided by the house. "I had you investigated," Beatrice said without preamble. "Clara Santos, an orphan, raised by your grandmother in North Carolina, came to New York 12 years ago, impeccable work history, no debt, no suspicious connections. You're exactly what you appear to be, a poor, honest woman." She finally turned to Clara, a smile that didn't reach her eyes on her face. "Which makes all of this even more confusing. Honest people don't usually involve themselves in schemes to take advantage of vulnerable men." The insult was direct. "I'm not taking advantage of anyone," Clara replied, her voice steady. "Your brother asked me to stay." "My brother is desperate," Beatrice retorted, "and desperation makes him blind. He's clinging to a fantasy, and you and your son are feeding it. Tell me, what do you really want? Money, a trust fund, company stock, name a price. I'll pay it for you to disappear and end this charade before it destroys everything." Clara felt her blood boil. The arrogance of this woman was suffocating. She looked at Beatrice, the woman who had everything, wealth, power, beauty, and saw an emptiness that no amount of capital could fill. "You don't get it, do you?" Clara said, with a surprising calm. "There are things in the world that don't have a price. Things like faith, hope, and my grandmother's wisdom. Your brother doesn't need less hope. He needs more. And maybe," she added, daringly, "so do you." Before Beatrice could respond, the door opened again and David ran in, holding a tablet. "Mom, look! Mr. Richard gave it to me. It has games." Beatrice glanced at the expensive device in the boy's hands and then back at Clara, her expression hardening into a mask of pure contempt. She said nothing more. She just turned and left, leaving behind a silence thick with threats. That night, the tension in the penthouse reached its peak. During the evening application, Richard was more irritable than ever. Nothing, no twitch, no warmth, just the dead feeling of his legs. "Enough," he shouted, pushing David's hand away. "I'm tired of this game. It's useless. It was just a fluke, a lucky spasm. You two, I think my sister was right." He turned to Clara, the pain in his eyes twisting into a cold cruelty. "I want you to pack your things. I'll arrange for a generous sum of money for you. Consider it payment for services rendered, but I want you out by morning." Richard's words hit Clara like a bucket of ice water, to be dismissed, discarded. The humiliation was profound, but what hurt more was the raw pain on his face. The way hope had curdled into poison before her eyes. She felt tears sting, but she swallowed them. She would not give him, or Beatrice, the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She just nodded, a stiff, pained movement. "As you wish," she said, her voice low but dignified. She took David's hand, who was looking at Richard with an expression of deep sadness, not for himself, but for the man in the chair. "Come on, sweetie." As she turned to leave, David's voice, surprisingly strong, cut through the tense silence of the room. "You're wrong." Richard, who had already begun to wheel his chair away, stopped. He turned slowly, an eyebrow raised in a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "What did you say?" "The ointment isn't magic," David continued, taking a step forward, letting go of his mother's hand. "My grandma says it just helps the earth wake up, but it's the seed that has to want to sprout. The ointment wakes up your bones, but you're the one who has to want to walk." The simplicity of those words, the ancestral wisdom condensed in a child's logic, completely disarmed Richard. He looked at the boy, at the earnestness in his eyes, and saw a truth none of his expensive doctors had ever dared to tell him. The problem wasn't just in his atrophied nerves. The problem was in his soul. The bitterness was the real disease. The paralyzed legs were just the symptom. My grandma told me a story, David said, moving closer, unafraid, about a man in our town who got sad after his wife became a star in the sky. He stopped walking too, even though his legs were fine. He just sat in his rocking chair for a year, staring at nothing. Richard stiffened, the mention of his wife hitting him like a physical blow. One day, David continued, his son brought him a little bird with a broken wing. The man got angry, said he didn't want to take care of anything else that was broken, but the boy insisted, and every day he cared for the bird in front of his father. One day, the bird started to flap its wing, and the man, seeing that, cried. He got up from his chair and helped his son set the bird free. He walked again because his heart learned how to fly again. The silence that followed was deep and resonant. Clara looked at her son, amazed by his courage and his old soul. Richard stared at the boy, and the defenses he had built for 5 years began to crumble, brick by brick. David's story wasn't an accusation. It was a mirror, and in it, Richard saw himself, the man in the rocking chair, staring at nothing, refusing to care for anything broken, least of all himself. He remembered Helena. He remembered how she had loved his drive, his strength in building an empire from a small inheritance and a lot of guts. But she had also loved his laugh, his ability to be delighted by small things, a side of him he had buried along with her. Was he honoring her memory by becoming this bitter monster? Or was he betraying everything they had been together? Richard's voice broke. He cleared his throat, trying to reassemble the facade, but it was too late. The crack was now a chasm. I don't know how to fly again. It was a confession. The first time in 5 years he had admitted not just his physical weakness, but his emotional bankruptcy. David smiled, a genuine, luminous smile. You don't have to fly, he said. You just have to try to flap your wings. In that moment, something fundamentally shifted in the dynamic between them. It was no longer about a miracle cure, a mysterious ointment, or an arrogant dare. It became something deeper. Clara, sensing the sanctity of the moment, stepped forward. Richard, she said, her voice soft but firm. Tomorrow, instead of just using the ointment, let's do something different. Let's take you outside. To the garden. Richard looked at her, surprise on his face. He hadn't been to the rooftop garden of his own home since the accident. It was Helena's garden, her favorite place. It was a sanctuary of memories he couldn't bear to visit. I can't, he whispered. It's too painful. Healing is painful sometimes, Clara answered, but you won't be alone. We'll be with you. Richard looked from Clara's gentle face to David's hopeful one. For the first time, he didn't feel like a patient being treated, but like a person being cared for. The proposition was terrifying, but the thought of sending them away, of returning to the solitude of his bitterness, was infinitely worse. He took a deep breath, his chest aching with the effort of feeling something new. All right, he said. Tomorrow, the garden. The next morning dawned with a soft, promising light, different from the harsh, impersonal glare that usually flooded Richard's penthouse. The simple decision to go to the garden had changed the atmosphere of the home, charging the air with an electricity of anticipation and apprehension. For the staff, accustomed to their boss's bitter reclusiveness, the order to prepare the garden access was a shock. They moved with a quiet efficiency, but they exchanged curious, surprised glances. Richard had barely slept. The night had been a whirlwind of memories of Helena, of the sound of her laughter as she planted roses, the smell of soil on her hands, the way the sunlight would catch in her hair. They were ghosts he had locked away for 5 years, and now they were free, dancing painfully in his mind. When Clara and David arrived at his suite, they found him already dressed, sitting in his wheelchair, staring intently at the door that led to the terrace. There was a rigidity in his posture, a silent battle being waged on his pale face. Clara said nothing about the ointment. She understood that today's healing would not come from the small tin can, but from the sun and the earth. "We're ready when you are," she said, her voice as calm as a breeze. The journey to the garden was a tense procession. Richard navigated the wheelchair with mechanical precision, his eyes fixed forward, avoiding the framed photos of Helena on the walls, images of a happiness that now seemed to belong to another life. The garden was a masterpiece of landscape design, an oasis suspended above the concrete jungle of New York City. It was Helena's project, her refuge. After her death, Richard had hired the best gardeners in the city to maintain it exactly as she had left it, turning it into an untouched museum of her memory. As he entered the open space, the scent of jasmine and damp earth hit him with the force of a wave. It was her scent. For a moment, he faltered, panic seizing his chest. "I can't do this," he gasped, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "Take me back." Clara knelt beside him, her presence a calming anchor. "Breathe, Richard. Just breathe. Feel the sun on your face." He squeezed his eyes shut, obeying. The warmth of the sun on his skin was real, present. Slowly, the wave of panic began to recede. David, with the natural intuition of children, approached a bed of red roses, Helena's favorites. "Look!" he exclaimed, pointing to a small bud about to bloom. "This one's going to be beautiful." Richard opened his eyes. He followed the boy's finger and saw the rose, a new life, stubbornly pushing its way toward the light. He remembered the day he and Helena had planted that very rose bush, their hands covered in dirt, laughing like children. The memory wasn't just painful. For the first time, it held a sliver of sweetness, a nostalgia that didn't break him. "Your wife must have loved it here," Clara said, walking slowly among the flower beds. "You can feel the love in every plant." Richard watched her. She touched the petals of an orchid with a delicacy that reminded him of Helena. But Clara wasn't a replacement. She was different, with her quiet strength, her unshakable dignity. She wasn't trying to fill the void Helena left, but rather helping him find a way to live with it. They spent the whole morning in the garden. David, fascinated, asked questions about every flower, and Clara, who grew up surrounded by nature, answered with a simple, profound knowledge. Richard, for the first time in years, just listened. He heard the sound of the wind in the leaves, the buzz of a bee, the voices of Clara and David mingling in a soft melody. He didn't try to move his legs. He didn't think about his fortune, his business, his stocks. He just was. When the sun grew stronger, Clara decided it was time to go back inside. As they prepared to leave, David ran to Richard, holding something in his cupped hands. "For you," he said, opening them. In his palm was a handful of dark, rich soil from the rose bed. "My grandma says we need to touch the earth to remember we're alive." Richard stared at the soil, at the profound simplicity of the gesture. With a trembling hand, he reached out and touched it. It was cool, damp, and incredibly real. In that touch, he felt a connection, a spark of life that came not from his nerves, but from a place far deeper. He closed his hand around the soil, holding it as if it were a treasure. That night, the ritual with the ointment was different. There was less tension, less desperate expectation. As David applied the paste, Richard didn't focus on forcing a movement. Instead, he remembered the feeling of the sun on his face and the earth in his hand. He thought of the rose about to bloom, and when David finished and said his usual, "There, now try," Richard took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and without effort, without fury, but with just a calm intention, he thought about moving his foot, and smoothly, almost like a caress, all 5 toes of his right foot curled. Slowly and deliberately, the movement was fluid, intentional, not a violent spasm like the first time, but a clear command sent from the brain and obeyed by the muscles. Richard opened his eyes, his heart beating a steady, heavy rhythm. He looked down at his own foot, now resting inert again, but the memory of the sensation, the newfound control, was undeniable. He lifted his gaze to Clara, and their eyes met in a silence charged with meaning. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her weary face. There was no triumph in her look, just a shared joy, a quiet confirmation that they were on the right path. David, seeing the success, clapped his hands softly. "I knew it," he whispered, as if sharing a secret. That moment was the true turning point. The cure, Richard was beginning to understand, was not a singular event, but a journey. And it wasn't just physical. David's ointment might awaken his nerves, but it was the boy's wisdom and Clara's patience that were beginning to heal his soul. The visit to the garden became part of their daily routine. Every morning they would go up, and Richard, bit by bit, began to reconnect not only with Helena's memory, but with himself. He started to talk about her, not with the sharp pain of recent loss, but with the sweet melancholy of remembrance. He told Clara about how they met in college, how she had encouraged him to leave the safety of a corporate job to found Titan Mining, risking all their initial capital on a bold gamble. He spoke of their dreams, of the plans they'd made for retirement, plans that involved sailing the world, far away from the stock market and the pressures of business. Clara listened in silence, her presence a source of comfort and acceptance. She didn't offer empty platitudes or easy advice. She just listened, and in her gaze, Richard found an empathy that allowed him to be vulnerable without feeling weak. With this new inner peace, his physical progress accelerated. The movements became more frequent, stronger. He went from wiggling his toes to flexing his ankle, then to contracting his calf muscle. Physical therapists were brought in, this time not with the skepticism of before, but with a new hope. They were astonished. The nerve regeneration they were witnessing defied medical logic. They designed a rigorous rehabilitation program with daily exercises to strengthen the awakening muscles. Richard embraced the pain and the effort with the same determination that had made him a billionaire. Each physical therapy session was a battle, leaving him exhausted and drenched in sweat, but every day he felt more alive. During this time, the dynamic in the penthouse changed. Richard began to smile. He spoke to the staff, asking about their families. The atmosphere of fear and tension that had once permeated the home was replaced by an air of cautious optimism. The only dark cloud on the horizon was Beatrice. She watched her brother's transformation with a mixture of astonishment and suspicion. His recovery was undeniable, and that frustrated her. Her theory of a grift was falling apart, but her distrust of Clara only deepened. She couldn't understand the influence this simple woman had over her brother. For Beatrice, power came from wealth and control, from assets and net worth. Clara's strength came from a place she couldn't quantify or comprehend, and it frightened her. One evening, she cornered Richard in his study. "This has gone on long enough, Richard," she said, her voice taut. "I'm glad you're improving, I truly am, but you're becoming dependent on her. You're giving her and her son a power over you that is unwise." "It's not power, Beatrice. It's support," he answered calmly, not taking his eyes off the report he was reading. "Something I haven't had from you in the last 5 years." The truth of his words stung her. She had always seen him as a leader, the iron pillar of the family and the company. When he fell, she had tried to keep the structure standing, focusing on the business, the profits, the dividends, believing that's what mattered. It never occurred to her that what he really needed was a shoulder, not a vice president. "I'm just trying to protect you," she insisted, her voice a little softer. "To protect us. Titan's stock is up 10% since the rumors of your miracle recovery started to leak. But stability is fragile. Any scandal— There will be no scandal, he cut her off, finally looking at her. There was a new authority in his gaze, a calm that was more intimidating than his old fury. Clara and David are my guests. They are my family. And if anyone in this company or in this house treats them with anything less than the utmost respect, they will answer to me. Do you understand? Beatrice recoiled, shocked by the word he had used. Family. The cleaning lady and her son. It was unthinkable. She left the study in silence, but a new, dangerous idea was beginning to form in her mind. If she couldn't get rid of them with accusations or money, perhaps there was another way to expose Clara as the fraud she believed her to be. A way that would strike at the very heart of the naive faith her brother now placed in the earth's healing. She picked up her phone. Harris, I have a new job for you. I want you to go to the Appalachian Mountains. Beatrice's order set a cold, calculating machine in motion, far removed from the oasis of hope blooming in the New York penthouse. Harris, her head of security, was an efficient and discreet man whose loyalty was bought with a generous salary and a complete lack of questions. In less than 48 hours, he was in a small town in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a world of red clay, imposing rock formations, and a pace of life that seemed to belong to another century. His mission was clear: find David's grandmother, the source of the mysterious ointment, and uncover her secret. He was to use any means necessary: money, intimidation, deceit. Beatrice wanted the recipe, or better yet, proof that it was all just charlatanism. While Harris delved into the rural mountains, Richard reached a monumental milestone. After weeks of intense physical therapy and the routine of emotional healing with Clara and David, he managed, for the first time, to stand. Supported by 2 parallel bars in the rehab room, with his physical therapist on one side and Clara on the other, he pushed his body upward, the muscles in his legs trembling violently with the Herculean effort. His legs locked. He was standing. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the tears he didn't try to hold back. The entire room held its breath. He looked down at his own feet planted firmly on the floor, a sight he thought he would never see again. The sensation of his own weight on his legs, the height, the different perspective of the world, it was overwhelming. He looked at Clara, and the gratitude in his eyes was so intense that words would have been insufficient. In that moment, he realized something that both frightened and thrilled him in equal measure. His feelings for her went far beyond gratitude. He admired her strength, her resilience, the way she chided him for his bitterness, and celebrated every small victory with genuine joy. He was falling in love with her gentle soul and her unshakable heart. News of his progress spread like wildfire. The financial market reacted with euphoria. Titan mining stocks soared, generating significant profits and further increasing Richard's already vast net worth. The business world was in awe, and the press began to sniff around the story of the billionaire who was defying medicine. But for Richard, the greatest wealth was the sound of David's laughter echoing through the penthouse halls, the calming presence of Clara by his side. One evening, as they sat in the garden under a starry sky, he decided to share something he had never told anyone, not even Beatrice. After the accident, he began, his voice low, the doctors told me about an experimental surgery in Switzerland. Extremely risky, a 1 in 1,000 chance of success, and a huge risk of permanent neurological damage, even to my mind. Clara listened intently, her face soft in the moonlight. I refused, he continued. Everyone thought it was because I was scared, or because I'd already given up. But the truth is, I thought I deserved it. I was driving that car. I survived, and Helena didn't. The wheelchair, it felt like a fair penance, a way to punish myself. The confession hung in the air, fragile and painful. I was trapped in a debt to myself, an emotional liability I thought I could never repay. I built an empire of gold, but I lived in a prison of guilt." He turned to her, his eyes shining with emotion. "You and David, you didn't just heal my legs. You taught me how to forgive myself. You showed me that I deserved a second chance, and that is a treasure no money can buy." In the Appalachians, Harris's investigation hit an unexpected wall: the community. The small town was a web of family ties and loyalty. No one spoke to strangers about Grandma May, David's grandmother. She was a respected figure, the keeper of plant knowledge, and the community protected her fiercely. Harris tried offering money. He was met with cold stares and closed doors. He tried a more subtle approach, inventing a story about a sick relative. People just directed him to the small local clinic. Harris's frustration grew. He reported his failure to Beatrice, who became increasingly impatient. Finally, he changed tactics. He stopped looking for Grandma May and started looking for someone who might be jealous of her, someone with a grievance, someone who could be bought. And he found him, a man named Jed, a distant cousin of Clara's, known in the area for his laziness and his taste for cheap whiskey. After a few bottles paid for by Harris at a local tavern, Jed's tongue loosened. He complained about how May never shared her secret recipes, how she could make a lot of money from them but preferred to live simply. With the promise of a sum that, to Jed, represented a fortune, he agreed to help Harris. He didn't know the exact recipe for the ointment, but he knew where May gathered her herbs, a hidden clearing deep within the national forest, a place considered sacred. Jed's plan was simple. He would lead Harris there, and they would gather the plants themselves. Beatrice, upon hearing the news, was exultant. She didn't need the recipe, just the ingredients. She would have them analyzed by a lab and prove they were nothing but common weeds with no medicinal properties. She would debunk the miracle, humiliate Clara, and bring her brother back to the real world, the world of skepticism and verifiable facts. The trap was set. While Beatrice's plot unfolded miles away, in Richard's penthouse, life followed a course of transformation and discovery. Richard's progress was steady and inspiring. He could now take a few steps, leaning heavily on a walker, his body trembling with effort, but each step was a resounding victory. The penthouse, once a silent mausoleum, was now often filled with the sounds of his physical therapy sessions, the grunts of exertion, and the encouraging cheers of Clara and David. The relationship between Richard and Clara deepened daily, evolving from quiet gratitude to a tender partnership. They shared dinners in the garden, talking for hours about their lives, their fears, and their dreams. Richard discovered in Clara a sharp intelligence and a sense of humor that delighted him. Clara, in turn, began to see beyond the bitter billionaire, discovering a man of profound sensitivity, scarred by pain, but with an immense capacity for love. Love grew between them, organic and inevitable, a strong green shoot emerging from the once barren soil of their lives. It was a love that needed no grand declarations, for it was manifest in the small gestures, the way she adjusted the blanket over his legs at night, the way he asked for her opinion on a new investment, not for financial need, but because he valued her perspective. David was the golden link that bound them. Richard developed a fatherly affection for the boy. He taught him chess, helped him with his homework, and listened, fascinated, to his stories about the Appalachian Mountains. He saw in David a purity and faith that had been eradicated from his own life, and being near the boy was like drinking from a clear spring. He began to think of David's future, planning to set up an investment fund to guarantee his education and his future, a net worth the boy would never need for happiness, but which Richard felt the need to give. However, the shadow of Beatrice continued to loom. She kept up appearances, congratulating Richard on his progress, but her eyes remained cold, and her courtesy toward Clara was as thin as a sheet of ice. Clara sensed the latent hostility, and it worried her, not for herself, but for Richard. She feared his sister's disapproval might somehow undermine the fragile peace he had achieved. Hundreds of miles away, in the Appalachians, Beatrice's plan entered its crucial phase. Guided by Jed, Harris hiked for hours under the hot sun, following nearly invisible trails. Finally, they reached a small clearing, a place of serene beauty where several unusual-looking plants grew in abundance. Jed pointed to a shrub with dark green leaves and small purplish flowers. "That's the one," he said, greed glinting in his eyes. "That's the main one. May calls it bone warm." Harris, following Beatrice's instructions, did not pick the plants. Instead, he took a small bottle from his pack containing a powerful herbicide, concentrated and odorless. While Jed was distracted, he sprayed the liquid liberally over the plants, soaking the leaves and the soil around them. He knew that in a few days, Grandma May's sacred plants would be dead, their roots scorched. The source of the miracle would dry up. It was an act of calculated cruelty, a blow aimed not just at the plants, but at the faith that surrounded them. Beatrice believed that without a resupply of the ointment, Richard's recovery would stall. The spell would be broken, and he would finally see that he had been fooled by a placebo and his own desperate mind. Back in New York, Richard decided it was time to take the next step in his recovery and in his life. He scheduled a special meeting of the Titan Mining Board. He didn't disclose the reason, sending a wave of speculation through the corporate world. Was he announcing his retirement, the appointment of a new CEO, the sale of the company? The tension was palpable. On the eve of the meeting, he called Clara into his study. He was standing, leaning on a pair of crutches, a sight that still moved her. "Clara," he said, his voice serious, "tomorrow is an important day, and I want you and David to be there, in the front row." "Richard, I don't think that's our place," she began, intimidated by the idea. "It is exactly your place," he interrupted her, his voice gentle but firm. "Everything I'm going to do tomorrow, everything I have become, is because of you two. Please, I need you there." She agreed, her heart racing. That same evening, Beatrice received a call from Harris. "It's done," he said. "In a week, there won't be anything left in that clearing." Beatrice smiled, a cold, triumphant smile. The charade was about to end. What she didn't know was that in trying to destroy the foundation of her brother's hope, she was about to trigger an event that would change the course of their lives in a way she could never have foreseen. The stage was set for a collision of worlds, faith against skepticism, love against ambition, and the outcome would be far more shocking than a simple physical recovery. The morning of the board meeting arrived crackling with an electric energy. Executives and major shareholders packed the same panoramic conference room where months earlier Richard had thrown down his challenge to David. This time, however, the atmosphere was not one of tension and frustration, but of an almost feverish curiosity. Whispers about the CEO's miracle recovery and the future of Titan mining filled the air. Clara and David sat in the front row, as Richard had requested. Clara felt out of place in her simple dress, a fish out of water in a sea of expensive suits and understated jewelry that was likely worth more than her old apartment. David, however, was calm, his eyes taking everything in with a serenity that belied the general anxiety. Beatrice sat at the head of the table, next to Richard's empty chair, the picture of corporate elegance. She shot Clara an icy glare, a silent warning that, despite appearances, the war was not over. She was confident, waiting for the moment when the ointment farce would be revealed and the natural order of things, where money and logic prevailed, would be restored. The door opened. A sudden hush fell over the room. Richard entered. He was not in his wheelchair. He was walking, slowly, deliberately, with the aid of 2 crutches, but he was walking. Each step was a visible effort, his brow furrowed in concentration, but they were his own steps, on his own 2 legs. The room erupted in a collective gasp of astonishment. People rose to their feet, eyes wide, some with their mouths agape. It was one thing to read about the rumors. It was another thing entirely to witness the reality. Richard crossed the room, the tap of his crutches on the marble floor marking the rhythm of his triumph. He didn't stop at the head of the table, his seat of power. He continued until he stood directly in front of Clara and David. He turned to face the audience of executives, his face gleaming with sweat and emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong, resonating with a new authority. "My apologies for bringing you all together on such short notice. For the past few months, many of you have heard stories about my health. Today, I wanted you to see the truth with your own eyes." He paused, catching his breath. "But that is not why I called you here. My physical recovery is merely a symptom of a much deeper change." His eyes found Clara's. "For 5 years, I led this company from a place of bitterness and darkness. I focused solely on profits, on dividends, on growing our net worth, and we succeeded. Titan Mining is richer and more powerful than ever, but I was bankrupt." A confused murmur rippled through the room. Beatrice watched him, her face a mask of incomprehension. "I lost the ability to see the true value of things," Richard continued. "And it was these two people," he placed a hand on David's shoulder, "who taught me the most important business lesson of my life. An investment that doesn't generate happiness is a rotten asset. Capital that doesn't serve humanity is just a burden." He took a deep breath. "Therefore, today, I am announcing the creation of the Helena Foundation, a new division of Titan with an initial investment of $500 million from my personal estate." The shock in the room was audible. 500 million, it was an astronomical sum. "The foundation will have 2 objectives," Richard explained. "First, to fund cutting-edge medical research that bridges science and traditional knowledge, and second, to create sustainable development projects in underserved communities like those in the Appalachian Mountains." He looked directly at Beatrice, whose pallor was now shocking. "This will not be a tax-deductible charity. It will be the new heart of our company. A portion of our annual profits will be directed to it, because true profitability isn't just on the stock charts, but in the good we can do in the world. And to lead this foundation," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I am appointing its first executive director." He turned to Clara, "The woman who taught me that the greatest wealth a man can have is hope, Miss Clara Santos." Beatrice's jaw dropped. The entire room was in a stunned silence. Clara looked at Richard, her eyes full of tears, shaking her head in disbelief. The director of a multi-million-dollar foundation. It was insane. It was impossible. At that exact moment, Beatrice's phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Harris. She glanced at the screen, desperate for anything to stop this madness. The message contained a single photo and one sentence. The photo was of a clearing filled with dead, blackened plants. The sentence read, "Mission accomplished. The source has dried up." A wave of cruel triumph washed over Beatrice. She had the weapon she needed. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly on the floor. "Brother!" Her voice cut through the air, filled with a barely disguised contempt. "Your display is moving. But before you hand over control of $500 million of our assets to this woman, perhaps the shareholders would like to know that her miracle cure is finished. The source of her magic ointment has dried up forever." Beatrice's accusation echoed in the silent room, laced with venom and triumph. She held up her phone, ready to display the photo as irrefutable proof of the fraud. All eyes swiveled from Richard to Clara, who went pale, the joy of moments ago turning to confusion and fear. She didn't understand the charge, but Beatrice's tone was unmistakable. Richard, however, did not look surprised. He faced her, not with anger, but with a deep, weary sadness. "The source, Beatrice?" he asked, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the tension. "You think the source of my healing was a shrub in some remote clearing?" He shook his head slowly. "You've spent so much time counting your gold, your dollars, your euros, that you've forgotten what truly has value. You looked, but you didn't see." He turned back to the audience of executives, his expression becoming that of a leader in full command of the situation. "My sister believes I was cured by a magic potion, and she is, in part, correct. But the magic wasn't in the ointment." He looked down at David, who watched him with unshakable confidence. The magic was in the faith of this boy, who didn't see a crippled CEO, but a man who needed help. He then turned to Clara, taking her hand with a gentleness that belied the strength of his presence. "The magic was in the strength of this woman, who taught me that true dignity lies not in a billion-dollar net worth, but in treating others with respect and compassion. The ointment, Beatrice, the ointment was just the match. My will to live, my desire to forgive myself, that was the gunpowder, and they are the ones who lit the fuse." The room was mesmerized. No one cared about financial reports or market projections anymore. They were witnessing something far more powerful, the redemption of a man. But Beatrice would not be defeated. The humiliation of being publicly rebuked fueled her rage. "That's a lovely speech, Richard," she sneered, her voice shrill. "Poetic, even, but it doesn't change the facts. She deceived you. She used some common weed and your desperation to worm her way into your life, into our company. You are putting the future of everything we've built into the hands of a charlatan." It was then that a small, crystal-clear voice spoke up. "My grandma is here." Everyone turned. David was pointing to a back door of the conference room. The door opened, and a small, wrinkled figure entered, guided by one of Richard's security guards. She was an elderly woman, with sun-weathered skin and braided white hair, dressed in simple, colorful clothes. Her dark eyes, however, held a wisdom and a strength that seemed to fill the room. It was Grandma May. Beatrice gasped. "How?" Richard smiled. "I suspected you might try something like this, Beatrice. So last week, I sent my private jet to pick up Grandma May from North Carolina. She and a few members of her community are my guests of honor." Grandma May walked slowly to the center of the room. She seemed unintimidated by the luxury or the powerful people. She looked at Beatrice, and her gaze was not one of anger, but of pity. "The girl from the big city," she said, her voice soft, but with a timbre that commanded attention. "You sent your man to kill my plants. You think the healing is in the leaves, the healing is in the earth, the healing is in the knowledge. The leaves die, but the earth remains. The leaves die, but the knowledge I pass on." She turned and smiled at David. "This one already knows." She then looked at Richard. "And this one," she said, "is learning." Grandma May moved closer to Beatrice, who took a step back, as if the old woman's presence burned her. "You have much pain in your heart, child. So afraid of losing what you have, you break the good things that come near. But true capital isn't what you keep, it's what you share." With those words, Beatrice's armor finally shattered. The humiliation was total and absolute. She had not been defeated by a business strategy or a financial maneuver, but by the simple, unassailable wisdom of a mountain healer. She looked around at the faces of the shareholders and saw not admiration for her cunning, but silent judgment for her cruelty. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, not as a powerful vice president, but as a diminished, defeated figure. The crisis had passed. The climax was not a battle of wills, but a triumph of truth. Richard addressed the board again, his voice clear and filled with conviction. "The proposal is on the table, the creation of the Helena Foundation under the direction of Clara Santos. We need a vote." There was no debate. The approval was unanimous, sealed with a round of applause that was not just for the business decision, but for the man Richard had become. The moment of greatest tension had been resolved, not with an explosion, but with the quiet, powerful affirmation of the values he had rediscovered. In the days following that momentous meeting, a new era began for Titan Mining and for everyone involved. News of the Helena Foundation's creation and the incredible story behind it leaked to the press, transforming Richard from a reclusive billionaire into a national figure of inspiration. The company's stock, rather than falling with the announcement of the massive social investment, soared to historic highs. Investors from around the world, drawn by the narrative of purpose and redemption, saw Titan not just as a source of profit, but as a business model for the future, where financial success and social responsibility were not mutually exclusive. The company's cash flow had never been healthier, its net worth growing on a foundation far more solid than just mineral extraction. Beatrice's defeat was quiet and final. She stepped down from her duties at the company, taking an indefinite leave of absence. Richard didn't fire her. In a gesture of compassion he would not have been capable of months before, he left the door open for her return. Should she ever find her way back, not to power but to family? Alone in her luxurious apartment, surrounded by a wealth that now felt empty, Beatrice was forced to confront the chasm she had created between herself and the world. Her journey would be long and solitary, but for the first time, there was a chance for true introspection. Clara, initially overwhelmed by the responsibility of running a multi-million-dollar foundation, threw herself into the work with the same dignity and common sense that had always guided her life. She did not try to transform herself into a corporate executive overnight. Instead, she brought her own wisdom to the role. Her first act was to assemble an advisory board that included Grandma May, renowned scientists, and community leaders. She traveled to the Appalachians, not as a CEO, but as a daughter of the mountains, listening to the needs of the people, establishing partnerships built on mutual respect. The foundation didn't impose solutions. It empowered communities to find their own, funding schools, sustainable irrigation systems, and cooperatives to protect and fairly trade the traditional knowledge of medicinal plants. She became a bridge between two worlds, that of great wealth and that of ancestral wisdom, proving that one could enrich the other in unimaginable ways. Richard, for his part, found a new purpose. While he continued to oversee the business of Titan, his passion became the foundation. He worked side by side with Clara, not as her boss, but as her partner. He used his vast business expertise to ensure the foundation was run with maximum efficiency, making sure every investment dollar had the greatest positive impact. His physical recovery continued to progress. He shed the crutches for a single cane, walking with a slight limp that served as a permanent reminder of his journey. The wheelchair remained in a corner of his study, not as a ghost of his past, but as a monument to his transformation. A symbol of where he had come from and the miracle that had put him on his feet. Their relationship blossomed away from the pressures of the boardroom. They found joy in simple things, walking in the garden, helping David with a science project, or just sitting in silence, enjoying each other's company. Their love was quiet, mature, and unshakable, forged in the fire of adversity and tempered by mutual respect. The main conflicts had been resolved. Richard's internal struggle against his bitterness and guilt had given way to forgiveness and a new purpose. The external threat from Beatrice had been neutralized by the force of truth and compassion. The tension between material wealth and spiritual well-being had found a harmonious balance in the mission of the Helena Foundation. The characters' narrative arcs found their natural conclusion. David continued to be the serene heart of the family, now with a bright and secure future ahead of him. Grandma May saw the wisdom of her ancestors honored and preserved for future generations. And Clara, the cleaning lady turned director, embodied the idea that a person's true worth lies not in their social position, but in the strength of their character. One afternoon, months later, Richard was in the garden, watching Clara and David plant a new rosebush. He walked towards them without the aid of his cane. The steps were slow, hesitant, but steady. He knelt on the ground. The movement was difficult, awkward, and took nearly all his strength, but he did it. He was kneeling on the earth in front of the woman who had changed his life. He took a small box from his pocket. It didn't hold a flashy diamond ring, but a simple, recycled gold band engraved with a tiny leaf. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that first day I made a stupid, arrogant dare. I offered you my fortune, but what I've discovered is that my real fortune, my entire treasure, is you and David." Tears streamed freely down Clara's face. "What I want to give you isn't my assets or my net worth. It's my name. It's my life. Will you marry me?" Richard's proposal, made with the humility of a reborn man, hung in the fragrant garden air. There was no trace of the arrogant CEO who had once mocked a child. Before Clara stood a man on his knees, not just physically, but in spirit, offering the one thing his vast fortune could never buy, his vulnerable, surrendered heart. Clara looked at him, her tears turning the afternoon sunlight into a shimmering prism. She saw their journey reflected in his eyes, the pain, the struggle, the healing, and finally, the peace. She glanced at David, who was smiling with the wisdom of an old soul, as if this moment was the destiny he had been guiding them toward all along. Her answer needed no words. She knelt too, her hands finding his on the soft garden soil. The yes was in her touch, in her smile, in the light in her eyes. In that instant, they sealed not a deal or an agreement, but a partnership of souls, a family born from the unlikeliest of seeds. The wedding was a simple, intimate ceremony held right there in Helena's garden, which had now become their garden. It was not an event for high society or the gossip columns. The guests were the household staff, a few close friends, Grandma May and her community, who brought the colors and songs of the Appalachian Mountains to the heart of New York City. Beatrice did not attend, but she sent a single, delicate bouquet of white roses with no card. It was a small step, a quiet acknowledgement, and Richard accepted it as the seed of a possible future reconciliation. The life they built together was a tapestry woven with threads of love, purpose, and simplicity. Richard never lost the sharp mind that made him a billionaire, but he now applied it differently. He revolutionized Titan mining, implementing sustainable practices and profit-sharing with employees, proving to the corporate world that ethics and profitability could go hand in hand. His greatest joy, however, was his work with the foundation. Traveling with Clara and David to open a school or a clean water well brought him a satisfaction that no closing bell on the stock exchange ever had. Clara thrived in her role, becoming a respected voice in the philanthropic sector, never forgetting her roots and using her position to give a voice to the voiceless. David grew up to be an intelligent and compassionate young man, with his mother's serene gaze and the determination of the man he proudly called his father. The trust Richard had set up for him was used not for luxuries, but to fund his studies in botany and ethnomedicine, following in the footsteps of his great-grandmother. The story of the millionaire in the wheelchair and the boy with the ointment became a kind of legend, a modern folktale about the power of faith and human connection. But for Richard, Clara, and David, it was not a legend, it was their life. It was proof that the greatest transformations come not from spectacular events, but from quiet moments of vulnerability, from the courage to ask for help and the generosity to offer it. Years later, on a sunny afternoon, Richard, now with silver hair, walked through the garden hand in hand with Clara. His limp was barely noticeable. They watched David, now a young adult, teaching a group of children about the properties of plants. He wasn't just passing on knowledge. He was planting seeds of hope, just as he had once done for a broken man in a boardroom. Richard turned to Clara, the love in his eyes deeper than any mineral vein his machines had ever excavated. "You know," he said softly, "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you had followed the rules and not brought David in that day." Clara smiled, her face lined with time and happiness. "Life finds a way," she answered. "What is meant to be finds its time. We were all broken in our own way, Richard, and only together could we become whole." He held her close, feeling the warmth of the sun on his back. His armor of skepticism had been reforged into a legacy of hope. He was no longer a prisoner of his wealth or his past. He was free, free to walk, free to love, and above all, free to believe that the truest miracles are not found in impossible cures, but in the extraordinary capacity of the human heart to open and bloom, even in the most barren of soils.